Once was a swagman camped by a billabong under the shade of a coolabah tree. As he sat, as he watched and waited while his billy boiled, "Who'll come a waltzing Matilda with me?" Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is Arnis Luks at the Freedom Forum, and our guest for today is Bill Daly from New Zealand. Welcome, Bill Daly.
Hello.
No worries. Now, Bill, we're fortunate enough. I'm a regular reader of Russia Insider, and I came across this article, and unbeknownst to me, I was part way through reading it, and then I realised that there's this bloke, Bill Daly, and it happens to be a New Zealander, and he happened to be responsible for writing this article. And I thought that's a ripper because it talks about the financial system and how we need to actually address the financial system as a core issue for civilization. But there are many questions that I think about it, but there are many questions you think about it. But let's see if Bill can give us a bit of a history that goes behind this article. Welcome, Bill.
Hello. Um, as a young chap, I came across the social credit movement, and I was introduced to that by the father of a girl who I'd been at school with, actually. We were working in the same place. I was recently out of school, and he was probably around about the age I am now, sort of not too far off 60. And I'd got into the habit of writing letters to the local newspaper in the South Island of New Zealand, and most of the chaps I worked with would pat me on the back and, oh, well done, young fella, and they weren't too interested in the content. I was, for a brief time, a member of the Labour Party in New Zealand, so I was writing along the lines of supporting that and really didn't know anything. And this chap, Mr. Hayes, said to me, he said, "I read your letter in this week's paper, and it's absolute rubbish. You haven't got a clue what you're talking about." So I thought, well, he doesn't come across as a fool. So I really wanted to know why he thought that. So in due course, I ended up at his house and we had long discussions, and he eventually loaned me some books and then later invited me to a meeting. So I think I was just around about turning 18-year-old at the time, and that was an Australian speaker, Eric Butler. And following on from that, there was another speaker, Jeremy Lee. I believe some of their talks are on YouTube. And following Jeremy's talk, Jeremy then gave a weekend seminar called Social Dynamics. And this just opened my mind in a way that it hadn't been opened before. And the main subject was my realization that the economic system, for want of a better term, inside a nation is so dominated by false thinking about money. And it's not just that the experts and the politicians and their advisors have false thinking about money, it's that society as a whole has false thinking about it. And what I learned at that seminar, it really came out of the early social credit movement, was that money correctly should be seen as an accounting system. It's a numbering system. And something I've said to people over the years, when Captain Cook, that's the English sailor, captain of the ship that came to New Zealand, and that led to British colonisation in New Zealand and Australia, when he came to our shores, there was no such thing as New Zealand pounds, which we had up till 1968, and there was no such thing as New Zealand dollars, which we've had since then. They simply did not exist. But that didn't prevent them from seeing that there was stuff on these islands that they could use. They could cut down kauri trees to make new masts. They could repair their boat with timbers they cut out of the forest. And they survived by finding fresh water to reload their tanks on their ship. They found fresh food, herbs and things like that for their health. Then, of course, with the coming of the colonizers, money was introduced. And a modern society cannot operate without money. Some type of accounting system that unites people in the productive capacities that they have available to them and to produce the things they want, and also for the distribution of those things. So the money system aids what naturally exists for people to cooperate amongst each other. And I learned all this at that weekend seminar, and I went away and it was weeks, just went round and round in my head. And I thought more and more about it, and I thought, why is there any poverty? There's no shortage of productive capability. So I really was very fortunate at such a young age to be introduced to that movement and to hear speakers who had spent decades talking about this. And they also led me to realise that trying to create a better society through the political party system is just a total waste of time, and it's a very corrupting influence on an individual and on a society, because it simply exists and is kept in place by a great deal of lies.
Thank you for that, Bill. That's an excellent opening salvo. Now, I noted in your article, and I'll read it, the international financial system may or may not be run by deliberately evil people, but the top of this structure is dominated by a disdain for nationhood and also a disdain for community and family, a people's heritage and personal freedom. Now, I see that you've touched on the, if you like, the a bit of history of the natural order, a bit of the reality of if you need something, you go ahead and do it, and if you've got the raw materials, you can achieve it, like a mast, or to restock the food supplies or the water supplies of a ship that's in transit and things like that. So these are all relating to what's there and harvesting the natural order, and I understand that. In your article, what you're bringing into account is you're bringing into account that we're in an age of industrialization. We're in an age of automation. And in that industrialization and automation, we work as a community, if you like. If you've got a big car manufacturing industry, we had it in Adelaide, huge car manufacturing industry, multiple, and they're all gone now. But the fact is that entire suburbs were dominated by providing labour, resources, skills, and knowledge in order to produce cars. And so, in that instance, it's a demonstration of community effort to produce goods. And what you're saying here is that there's a disdain for nationhood and community, and yet in actual fact the financial system should reflect that it's actually communities that's engaging in the productive process, not just an individual put their hand up, but rather an entire community, especially with the larger factories and that. Bill.
I think it's important to start with basics when it comes to grasping finance and the role that it plays. And one is that it is not wealth. Money is not wealth. And that's an extremely difficult thing to get our minds around, because we're so conditioned to thinking that money is wealth. But it's not. But a pound of butter is wealth. I like to give the example of a man who's in the desert. He's got no water, and he's going to die if he doesn't get some water soon. He could have $1 million, he could have $1 billion, $1 trillion. It wouldn't matter in which form, a check, actual cash, gold, silver, any other so-called precious metal. If he was given all of those things and was surrounded by all this money and this so-called precious metal, it wouldn't help him one iota. What he really needs is a little bit of water. One glass of water in that situation is of intensely greater value than all that money he would be surrounded by. So water is real wealth. The glass is real wealth. Timber for building houses is real wealth. Butter, food, all those things are real wealth. The things we make our clothing from and the clothing themselves are all real wealth. And I understand how the conditioning has come about, and some of it has definitely come about through propaganda and lies in order to mislead that money itself is wealth. But if we can get our minds around that money is not wealth, it's just a numbering system, we can do a great deal. And there's an old saying that a problem correctly stated is already half solved. And I believe that as soon as somebody frees their mind from thinking of money as wealth, and that economics is a really complicated subject and only those who've got degrees in that and have spent years at university are competent to give direction or advice concerning economics. As soon as we get our minds around what money is, what economics is, what it describes, in a sense, making it really simple, because at the basic level, it is extremely simple. And I think of Christ's thing, unless we become like a little child, we cannot enter heaven. I forget how it exactly goes. By which I understand that sometimes we get so caught up in what we think are the complications of something, we forget that usually there's a very simple solution. And just about every we could even talk about a large high-rise building. The construction of a high-rise building is done by simple blocks, in a sense. You nail this to that, you pour a bit of concrete, you do this. The whole structure appears to be extremely complicated and only experts could do it. And there is a certain amount of that. There's engineers involved and experienced builders and experienced administrators. But in the end, it's really built by simple logic. And we have to return to a certain degree of simplicity. And one of the reasons I think the monopolist, I'll use that term, the monopolist is the person who has that mind. Generally, or almost always, things are better when they're big. But the monopolist then fails to see the reality of the individual human being and the purpose of human association, which we could call family, society, community, a nation. You get very distracted away from that, and you start to look at the world through numbers and how the way the bankers describe things. And if you look at talks by people from, say, the World Bank, it's gobbledygook or gobbledygook in every sense. It's absolutely gobbledygook. And I remember Eric Butler and Jeremy Lee using terms like that, and others. But it's very confusing to the listener, who then is easily pushed into the position of thinking, oh, wow, these people are super clever. They're the experts. We have to leave it all up to them. A society, almost every society, has the physical wealth available to it for a good living for everybody. But the monopolist and the financial system has come out of the doctrine of monopoly. That is centralized power, bigness. And bigness goes against community. You can't have both. This whole thing called globalization is really a movement against nationhood and against community and against ultimately the individual human being, because you cannot have both. There's a war between the both. The individual who wants to have his sovereignty or her sovereignty, and the monopolist who says, the world would be a much better place if everybody did things our way. I believe that Henry Ford, who was obviously an amazing character, had initially, in the starting of his factory, believed that he would have housing where all the workers would live, and comfortable housing, close to the factories. And this would be for the sake of efficiency. But how do we define efficiency? And I think C.H. Douglas did it very well when he defined it as human satisfaction. So a man working at home in his little workshop, making something for his wife perhaps, or his children, a new front door, say, is getting tremendous satisfaction. He may take him 100 hours to make a really beautiful front door, but he could go down to the shop and buy one from a factory. That took 1 hour for someone in a factory with machinery to make. But in a sense, he's produced a little bit of art as a gift to his family and to himself and to anybody else who lives in that house. And it's given him great satisfaction. So therefore, from his point of view, it's kind of an efficient way of giving himself satisfaction and his family satisfaction. To the monopolist, that just seems utterly ridiculous. Why would you spend 100 hours making an ornate door when you can go down to the shop and buy one that's, kind of okay? I was fascinated in the 1990s by a book that came out by Sir James Goldsmith. I'd never even heard of him before, but he was a big timer. He came originally from, on his father's side of the family, from a prominent German Jewish banking family, but his ancestors had moved to England. But he himself turned against all that, and in his latter years of his life, he said we have to preserve small farming, small communities. This whole globalization thing is destroying people, and he went to the Mexican government, which was following the advice of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund to do the same that had happened in the Philippines. The theory being they'd get all the people as much as possible off the land and all these tiny little so-called inefficient plots, move them into the cities where they'd run factories, and Mexico would really get its economy going and it'd be big on exports. And he was pointing out to them, look, the Filipinos took this on 20, 30 years earlier, and it's a mess. The people left the land. The land is being farmed by monopolists, usually foreign owned. Those who are on the land with the farm are appallingly in debt, and large numbers of the people that had moved into the cities are living in slums with no future, no hopeful future for themselves and their children. So I thought, this man has got some character to him that he can see this. Apparently he even went to Henry Kissinger and said, listen, this whole program, and he said, described Kissinger as a friend, and he said, I said to him, this whole program is insane. It's not where we need to go. So he ended up in the European Parliament representing a rural area, I believe, of France, very dedicated to keeping the small man on the farm. And something he said has always struck me. He said it's often said that a man on a large farm with a large tractor is more efficient than another man on a small farm. And he said, yes, in the amount of production of the man with the large farm and the large tractor and the large harvesting equipment, certainly he's producing a great deal more grain or whatever than the man on the little farm. However, from a land area point of view, the little farm actually produces more, because he will have crops more suited to, say, a sunny side of his field to a shaded side of the field. And there may be a little rocky outcrop in the middle of a field, and he will do something with that. He may have some goats running there or something, but from the big farmer's point of view, the monopolist point of view, that's a useless land. You just leave that. And just little things like that. He was pointing out that essentially that smallness and community and family are in the direction we should be heading. And he did kind of touch on the money thing. I haven't got it before me, but in the early part of the book he wrote called The Trap, which is written in the form of an interview with a French journalist, he clearly indicates that he shows there is a terrible problem with the financial system and our understanding of it. And he particularly mentions, I think, what's called GDP, gross domestic product, which is really just a measure of how much money changed hands in a particular country during the last 12 months or in any particular period. And he said that if a country has a natural disaster like an earthquake and lots of buildings fall over and a huge amount of money has to be spent to put them up again, at the end of the year, the economists and the bankers and the politicians will look at it and say, oh, the economy's done much better this past year because more money changed hands. Another example he gave of the ridiculousness of existing economic measurements was, you have a woman who looks after her own children, then she decides to go and get a job, and she employs another woman to look after her children. More money exchanges hands in the community in that country during that past year because of this, and it's classed as the country is richer. But he said, how can you say a community is richer because the mother is no longer looking after her own children? She's got a hired help to do that. And I think he was a very practical man. He almost went as far as some of the people in what we call the social credit movement, as far as realizing we have to get a proper right relationship with what money is and what it isn't. And it's really a very simple thing, going back to Christ said, unless we have the mind of a little child, we're not going to come to a solution.
That's excellent. I'm gobsmacked by what you're saying here, Bill, because I think it's absolutely profound. Now I want to actually bring up a website. I've just done a search of this Goldsmith bloke, and I had no trouble at all in finding Sir James Goldsmith The Trap in PDF form on the web. So anyone who's interested in reading it, all you've got to do your Google search, and there it is right in front of you. Small is beautiful. That's what I'm hearing from you, Bill. Small is beautiful. That the system should be made to serve man. That the system should be measured in measures of human satisfaction, not in numbers, not in statistics, but actually how we as people are working in community, producing the things that we're doing, and how do we actually assess these things? Is it just numbers? Is it and the big ticket that I noted in your article, Bill, was of course that the the people who do the counting, and you get raw materials and you get labor, you get technology, machines, and you get an accountant in charge of it to administer it, the actual cost, and then on the basis of the cost that's going on, and then you say, well, okay, we need to actually sell these things that we've just produced, and you say, okay, well, how much has actually gone out in wages? And that's only a percentage. It's only, in actual fact, it's a diminishing percentage. How much goes out in wages? And that's the actual current spending power issued as a consequence of what communities produce. And I think that's most important. That to me is the heart of what we're talking about here, and that is the chronic shortage of purchasing power. Back to you, Bill.
Um, yeah, I agree with that. There's quite a few factors come in here. One is ideology, and I use the term, it's not my term, but I think it's a very good term, and that is Puritanism. And that is the general idea that human beings must be forced to do something to keep them busy. Life should not be too easy, because otherwise they can't organise themselves and they'll just get themselves into a mess, into trouble. I think a responsible human being has to reject that. But there are people who hold very strongly to it, and that is a very dominant theme in modern Western society at least, and perhaps elsewhere as well. And perhaps we all at times have a little bit of this inside ourselves. So I don't want to just say they're the Puritans and these people aren't, because we are conditioned by the environment to some extent in which we live, and it's very hard for someone to get their mind to think outside the box. This is how Granddad thought, and this is how my father thought, or my mother thought. This is how my brothers and sisters and the teachers at school think, so therefore I sort of have to fit in with that. It's very hard for someone to be able to stand back and say, well, what I was taught about that, actually that seems really good, but what I was taught about this over here, that just doesn't make sense. It doesn't fit into reality. And not everybody is able to do that. But obviously some can, and depending on circumstances, sometimes a crisis in a nation actually forces people simply to be more realistic. Not too many years ago in the New Zealand city of Christchurch, we had a terrible earthquake. We had a series of earthquakes, one, and then a year later there was another one, a big one, and huge amount of damage done. And I remember reading an article by, I believe, an American of Japanese extraction, going by his name, talking about this thing of emergency services advising people to keep a certain stock of water, fresh water, and food in their homes. But he said he had observed when there had often been some crises, such as the 3 Mile, I think it's called the 3 Mile nuclear meltdown or near meltdown they had in the United States a few years, some decades ago, and he referred to this Christchurch earthquake, and he said what actually happens is everybody shares. He said there was numerous examples of the earthquake, houses have fallen down, they've fallen over, and as soon as the parents, the father, the mother, whatever, had realised that we're okay, they rushed off to see if their neighbours were okay. Though I found that really moving. It showed that deep down, nobody's thinking about how much money can I get to go and see if the neighbour's all right. I'm not worried about my mortgage right now. I'll think about that in a week's time. It was just people really, and he said everywhere, pretty much when there was these things happened, it may vary from culture to culture, but certainly in these examples, that people simply went straight out to try to help each other. That showed initiative, it showed love, it showed something that's deep inside a person and which conventional economics does not bring forth as a factor in trying to shape how our societies function. And human beings cannot be fitted into an economic system that is divorced from reality, except by force. And really that's where we're at. We are forced to do things in order to survive materially, things which generally we're not drawn to. We may do. I work as a carpenter these days, and I really enjoy my job. I would prefer to do, say, 3 days a week, maybe 4 days a week, or a couple of weeks a month, but I can't afford to do that. And the way the system works, I need to do 5, sometimes 6 days a week. There's bills to pay, there's mortgages to meet, and other sorts of commitments and stuff. And that would go for a great deal of people, but large numbers of people are actually forced into activities which they really don't enjoy. And I think of somebody having to work in a factory making junk products, which are going to be in the rubbish dump in no time at all. Sometimes the conditions aren't that healthy. Some of the plastic products that float around at Christmas time and then are in the rubbish tip a week or two later, just appalls me how many thousands of hours, perhaps millions of hours of workers in places like China and elsewhere, whether they're well paid or not, are spending their time making products that are just going to really just go straight to the rubbish tip. It's appalling, but this thinking that it's wrong to allow a human being to have economic freedom to the best possible and what is physically possible extent is a tremendous obstacle. And we all sort of agree that people should get a pension, when they've got too old to work anymore. And it should be kind of reasonable, although many people barely survive on it. But it's still that thinking that until you reach that age, you shouldn't be able to rest.
It's all wrong. It's all wrong. Really appreciate your candid point of view, Bill. When you talked about the appalling waste and the plastics, well, I I'm your age, I'm your generation, a little bit older, and I find it fascinating because I tinker with cars, I tinkered with houses. I spent 35 years in oil and gas, and so I actually do know how large turbines, large compressors are put together in a fashion where they can run for years. And I mean years around the clock, years. And they run 75,000 hours. I mean, the warranty might be 25,000, but they run 75,000 hours. They have tilt pad white metal bearings. They have tapered needle roller bearings. They have dry sumps, oil injection, filtered, conditioned oil, temperature control, the whole thing. And the fact is that if we want to build a machine and have it last a long time, we can. I think of the cars. I look at the cars and I think, hang on a sec. If they ran, I'll give you my 2 bob on it. If they ran a dry sump and a dedicated oil pump that had oil up to temperature and up to pressure prior to allowing the starter motor to engage, how long would the engine last for? Would it double the life, triple the life? And if they ran high viscosity oil, fully synthetic, would they double the life and triple the life again? I mean, the technology's there. We can do it. But we choose not to. And at 100,000 Ks, 200,000 Ks, then they're throwaway. And that to me is sad when you've got the stage of, cathodic protection, the shell of a car. You can use very low current in order to, and a sacrificial anode to protect the rust. I mean, there are so many things that we can do to make things last. And it comes back to, why would you do that? I mean, we need to sell the cars so that we get the money to buy what we need. And if we don't sell enough cars, we haven't got the money to buy what we need. And that's this question that social credit answers. And I think it's most profound. And Bill, you've done us a great service with this article. And I'll give you back the floor. Thank you.
I agree with your points. It came up earlier. I wouldn't want to lead people into thinking that I or members of the social credit movement, or I won't say members, it's a movement of interested people, and it's a source of learning and cooperation amongst people, are against bigness entirely. if we want to fly overseas, and many of us do from time to time, we sort of don't want to do it in an airplane that carries 2 people or 3 or 4 people. We do it we're in an airplane that carries hundreds of people. So there is a place for bigness, so long as it serves human beings. And shipbuilding and stuff, a lot of people, if they can afford it, go for sea cruises. I haven't done it myself. It sounds very nice. One day maybe I will do one. You sort of don't want to do it in a little boat, but can only hold 5 or 10 people. So it takes a lot of resources, a lot of infrastructure to build one of the modern ships. Whether they should be as big as they are or not, I don't know. But you want something of a reasonable size. So that takes expertise, trained engineers. And our society has developed a tremendous amount of cooperation in areas like engineering, our understanding of oil, our understanding of pressures of air and water and all those things, and different types of lubricants. We have a tremendous thing. And one term to describe that, not from me but from others, is our cultural heritage. And our cultural heritage is something that belongs equally to every human being alive today. Not everyone can enjoy it to the same extent, but it's things like all the inventions of the past, the good ideas. We don't have to reinvent those. They're there for us to use. So how many people today know who invented electricity? Does it really matter? It simply exists. We know it didn't exist 200 years ago, but it exists. The electric light bulb, the internal combustion engine, all these things, computers. I find them blasted nuisances unless I have someone like yourself to tell me what to do with them. But they work. They make communication easier. I think of them as a typewriter and a filing cabinet. And that's what serves my purpose, but it's a very efficient filing cabinet and typewriter, in that I can type something, I can make corrections much more easily than an old mechanical typewriter, and I can store things, and they can be there for years. I can go and look at them, add to them, to subtract from maybe an article or something like that, and store it for the future. So that's how I sort of see as a computer and stuff. Technology is a word used to describe primarily the developments for younger people in the modern world, in the internet field, the computer field. But technology is much more than that. All the machinery that's been developed with the beginning of steam and other developments after that have led us to the computer age. And I'll just add, it's not really related to this subject, but I think it's an important point, and that is somehow that computer technology or the internet is somehow going to solve so many of the problems we've got. It won't. I personally don't believe in this thing of the thinking computer. They may be able to be programmed to do certain things, including going around killing people. That may be possible. They may be able to make robots that do incredible things, for better or for worse. But a human being has a soul, and that connects them to their heritage, to their family, to their community, to the environment and the area in which they've grown up. And a human being can do things that no machine can ever do. A machine can be programmed to pretend it has feelings, for example. But it hasn't. It's just programmed to do that. And a human being with a soul is the one that did the programming. The computer can't do it. We may be able to get computers to make other robots to make other robots and stuff, but that we can never reproduce a human being. And I think it's a distraction that is pushed a lot, particularly on younger people, that somehow technology is going to solve all our problems. It won't solve the problem of debt. It won't solve the problem of too much centralized power. It won't solve the problem of family breakdown. These are problems that we have to deal in practical ways. They have a spiritual element to them. And the money system is right in many respects, right there in the middle, because it's the key tool used by the monopolists to control the entire universe to a very large extent. And And they can use finance. They can finance a war, but they can't finance the building of bridges and infrastructure for a community in peacetime. Or that community has to go into debt for decades, even centuries, to the money lenders in order to be able to get that local infrastructure that they need. So there is no physical reason why we can't have all the things we want and build things that last a long time. I think the modern education system is one of the ways of soaking up what would otherwise be a huge amount of increased employment and growing bureaucracies. A huge percentage of modern societies are actually employed by governments, or firms that contract to governments. And goodness knows what a lot of these people do. It stuns me how many millions of people drive to work every day and come back, but the real things that we need, the growing of food, the provision of houses, some roading, infrastructure like water on tap and electricity and all that, only a really tiny percentage of society is now involved in those things. The rest is very much make-work schemes. And that is that Puritan idea that we must not let people have economic freedom. They might have time to think, and they might think differently than what the monopolists want.
Beautifully put. Thank you, Bill. That's such a vivid picture in my mind of the potential that's there, and you touched on some very important points. The story of the Commonwealth Bank is one of the books we have in our ALOR library, and it speaks there of the director of the bank, Sir Denison Miller, and how he was able to finance significant infrastructure projects through Australia through the years from about 1912 to 1924. And I put it to you, ladies and gentlemen, that those years was also the First World War. Now, Australia came out of that First World War debt free. This is what Bill is talking about, that if you have the policy correct, then you can actually achieve these things in peacetime. We achieved the infrastructure projects, Australia achieved the infrastructure projects of the East West Railway Line, the Commonwealth woolen mills, the Commonwealth steamers, oil exploration. I mean, it goes on and on. The Board of Works in Victoria. I mean, there was significant expansion of infrastructure under Sir Denison Miller, and this was done in a fashion that was debt free. So the credit was released prior to the war, and during the war, and after the war, and we walked away from that debt free, which is what Bill is talking about. Policy, financial policy. The method of counting was such that it was actually, we were able to purchase and pay for what we were capable of producing as a nation. That's most profound. Most profound. We can't do that now. We've got to go to international banks. We've got to go to the Bank of International Settlements in Switzerland. I mean, to do what? To get numbers? I mean, this is madness. This is madness. Bill, we've gone over time, and I have really, really enjoyed having you in this interview. I would like you to come back. You've done a great job. Closing comments, please.
I will thank you, and I think it's just really important for the individual who wants to contribute to a better society to think outside the square, or think outside what's presented, primarily by the news media and established institutions. There's a wealth of information out there. There's a wealth of alternative views, and now, alongside that, we have to seek truth. Pontius Pilate asked Christ, "What is truth?" But truth is what works. This communication system is working because it has been wired correctly. My car goes, if I put petrol in it and oil and water, if I don't maintain it and don't put those things in it, it won't go. If I want the car to go, I have to obey the truths related to making that car go. I just give that as a simple explanation. Truth operates everywhere. If we want success in carpentry, if we're building a house, we have to put a good foundation down. You don't build the roof before you've done the foundation. It doesn't work like that. You're actually forced, when you work with your hands and do practical things, to obey truth. So it's the same with finance and economics and the relationships between people and society.
Beautifully put. Thank you, Bill. I'll remind our viewers that freedomforum.com.au, Bill's this video will be placed up there in the immediate future, and I welcome you to visit and see the updates as we work our way through these splendid, what I consider are splendid, high quality interviews. This is Arnis Luks. Once was a swagman camped by a billabong under the shade of a coolabah tree. As he sat, as he watched and waited while his billy boiled, he'll come a waltzing Matilda with me.